For millions of viewers across America and around the world, Michael Landon represented something rare on television: warmth, sincerity, and a quiet moral strength. Week after week, audiences welcomed him into their homes through the beloved series Little House on the Prairie. On screen, he portrayed Charles Ingalls, a devoted father who believed deeply in kindness, faith, and perseverance. His calm voice and steady presence made him feel less like an actor and more like a trusted member of the family. But behind that gentle image was a complicated story about loyalty, disappointment, and a difficult decision that would ultimately change television history. The end of the show was not simply a routine cancellation. It became one of the most emotional endings ever experienced by a cast, a crew, and a devoted audience. What many fans never realized was that the final chapter of the series was shaped not just by ratings or changing trends in television, but by personal choices and deep emotions behind the scenes. Years later, when Michael Landon finally explained why the show ended the way it did, it revealed a truth that surprised even the most loyal viewers. The ending of Little House on the Prairie was not an accident. In many ways, it was a farewell carefully shaped by the very man who had helped build its heart. When Little House on the Prairie first appeared on television in 1974, it entered a media landscape that was rapidly changing. Television was beginning to favor louder, faster entertainment, and networks were increasingly focused on modern themes and flashy storytelling. Against that backdrop, Little House offered something completely different. The series moved at a slower pace and placed emotional honesty at the center of every episode. Instead of relying on spectacle, it focused on ordinary people facing real struggles. The show was inspired by the autobiographical books of Laura Ingalls Wilder, but what viewers saw on screen became something larger than a simple adaptation. It was a reflection on family, hardship, resilience, and community. Episodes explored difficult subjects such as poverty, prejudice, illness, and loss, but they approached these themes with compassion and sensitivity rather than sensational drama. Audiences responded to that sincerity. Families watched together, often seeing parts of their own lives reflected in the Ingalls family's struggles and triumphs. Over time, Walnut Grove stopped feeling like a fictional town and started to feel like a place viewers truly knew. For many people growing up during the 1970s and early 1980s, the show became more than entertainment. It became a weekly reminder that even in the face of hardship, kindness and integrity still mattered. At the center of this world stood Michael Landon, whose influence reached far beyond his role as Charles Ingalls. Although viewers saw him primarily as an actor, his involvement behind the scenes was just as important to the success of the series. Landon frequently wrote, directed, and produced episodes, shaping the tone and direction of the entire show. His creative involvement ensured that the series maintained a consistent emotional voice. He believed strongly that the stories should remain grounded in honesty and compassion. That philosophy guided everything from casting decisions to the way dramatic moments were filmed. Colleagues often described Landon as demanding, but deeply committed to the work. He expected professionalism and dedication from everyone involved, but many also respected how fiercely he protected the spirit of the show. For him, Little House was not just another television project. It was a story about values he genuinely believed in. The friendships and working relationships formed during the production years were also unusually strong for a television series. Actors such as Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls, spent their formative years growing up on the set. The buildings of Walnut Grove were not simply props. They were part of daily life for the cast and crew for nearly a decade. As the series continued into later seasons, however, subtle changes began to reshape its direction. The young characters who once defined the heart of the story were growing older. Laura Ingalls herself had transitioned from childhood into adulthood, eventually marrying Almanzo Wilder and beginning a life separate from her parents. Naturally, the emotional center of the show began shifting away from Charles Ingalls and toward the next generation of characters. Michael Landon recognized this shift earlier than many viewers did. He understood that every television series has a natural life cycle, and he quietly began to wonder whether Little House was approaching its conclusion. While the program still maintained loyal viewers, the landscape of television was evolving. Networks increasingly favored faster-paced shows with younger casts and modern themes. At the same time, the workload Landon carried behind the scenes had become immense. Acting, writing, directing, and producing simultaneously demanded an extraordinary amount of energy. After years of maintaining that pace, exhaustion inevitably began to take its toll. Creative disagreements also emerged among some members of the cast, particularly regarding character focus and compensation. Although these tensions were not unusual in long-running productions, they signaled that the atmosphere surrounding the show was gradually changing. During this same period, Michael Landon's long relationship with the network NBC faced an unexpected turning point. Landon had spent most of his career working with the network, beginning with his breakthrough role as Little Joe Cartwright on the iconic Western Bonanza. That series had made him a household name and established a professional partnership that lasted many years. When Bonanza eventually ended, NBC supported Landon's next major project, which became Little House on the Prairie. For decades, the relationship between Landon and the network seemed built on mutual trust. But as television executives began reevaluating their programming strategy, priorities shifted. Industry leaders wanted younger audiences, modern storytelling, and faster packing. In that environment, a quiet historical drama like Little House no longer fit neatly into the network's evolving vision. According to several people close to the production, Landon was deeply hurt when he discovered that the show had quietly disappeared from NBC's upcoming schedule without direct discussion. For someone who had spent so much of his professional life contributing to the network's success, the lack of communication felt deeply personal. That moment would influence the way the story of Walnut Grove ultimately came to an end. As the final years of Little House on the Prairie approached, the emotional landscape of the series was changing in ways both visible and subtle. What had once been a story centered almost entirely around the Ingalls family slowly began expanding to include new characters and storylines. This transition was partly natural. The young actors who had defined the heart of the show were growing up, and their characters were moving into new stages of life. Laura, once the spirited little girl audiences had watched learn and grow, had become a married woman beginning her own household. Her journey reflected the passage of time within the world of Walnut Grove, but it also meant that the narrative focus was shifting away from Charles Ingalls. For Michael Landon, this raised an important creative question. The show had always been built around a father's perspective on family, hardship, and responsibility. As the storytelling moved beyond that original foundation, Landon began wondering whether the series could continue with the same authenticity that had made it meaningful in the first place. Behind the scenes, the workload Landon carried had become increasingly intense. Over the course of nearly a decade, he had taken on multiple roles within the production. He was not only the leading actor, but also a frequent writer, director, and executive producer. Maintaining that level of involvement required extraordinary dedication. Every script required careful attention, every episode demanded creative decisions, and every storyline needed to reflect the emotional sincerity that had defined the show from the beginning. Cast members often recalled how deeply Landon cared about the tone of the series. He believed that the audience trusted the show to treat serious topics with respect. Whether an episode explored grief, poverty, or prejudice, he insisted that it be handled with honesty rather than sensationalism. That commitment helped make the program unique, but it also meant that Landon rarely stepped away from his responsibilities. Over time, the constant pressure began to create exhaustion. Like many creators who dedicate years to a single project, he reached a point where continuing indefinitely no longer felt possible. Another factor influencing the future of the show involved changes within the television industry itself. By the early 1980s, networks were beginning to shift their priorities toward programming that appealed to younger viewers and reflected contemporary social trends. Historical family dramas were gradually becoming less common in primetime schedules. Even though Little House on the Prairie still had loyal viewers, it no longer matched the direction many executives wanted to pursue. At the same time, internal tensions were emerging within the cast. Actress Karen Grassel, who portrayed Caroline Ingalls, later spoke publicly about feeling that her character had become less central to the story. She also mentioned disagreements over salary and screen time. While such disputes were not unusual in long-running television productions, they highlighted the growing complexity of maintaining the series in its original form. For Landon, these developments reinforced a belief he had quietly held for some time. Every story has a natural conclusion, and forcing it to continue indefinitely could weaken what once made it powerful. Eventually, the show entered what many fans remember as its final transitional phase. The series was rebranded as Little House, a new beginning, shifting the focus toward the younger generation living in Walnut Grove. This creative decision allowed the world of the show to continue without relying entirely on Charles Ingalls. However, the change also created a different atmosphere for the program. Viewers who had followed the Ingalls family for years suddenly found themselves adjusting to a new narrative structure. While some appreciated the attempt to evolve, others felt that something essential had changed. For Landon, the experience confirmed his growing sense that the story was reaching its natural endpoint. He had always believed that the emotional core of the series rested in the relationship between parents and children, particularly the bond between Charles and Laura. Once that chapter had fully unfolded, continuing the show indefinitely risked transforming it into something very different from what audiences had originally embraced. When the decision was finally made to produce a concluding television film, the creative direction surprised many people involved with the production. The project, titled The Last Farewell, was designed not as a gentle wrap-up, but as a dramatic and definitive ending. The story centers on the residents of Walnut Grove discovering that a powerful landowner now controls the property on which their town stands. Faced with losing everything they built, the community makes a painful and symbolic decision. Rather than allowing their homes and institutions to be taken away, they choose to destroy the town themselves. The narrative was shocking to viewers who expected a sentimental farewell. Yet for the cast and crew who had spent nearly 10 years bringing Walnut Grove to life, the experience carried deep emotional weight. According to Melissa Gilbert, filming those final scenes felt less like a television production and more like saying goodbye to a place that had been part of their real lives. The destruction of Walnut Grove remains one of the most unforgettable moments in television history. Buildings that had stood for years on the set were blown apart during filming, including the church, the schoolhouse, and several familiar homes. These were not temporary stage props quickly assembled for a single scene. They were carefully constructed structures where actors and crew members had spent countless hours working together. Watching them disappear was emotionally overwhelming for many people involved in the production. Gilbert later described the experience as deeply painful, explaining that each explosion felt like another piece of their shared history disappearing. For viewers watching at home, the scene was shocking and dramatic. But behind the camera, it represented something even more profound: the closing of a chapter that had shaped the lives and careers of everyone who helped create it. Years later, when reflecting on that decision, Michael Landon explained that the ending was deliberate. He wanted to ensure that the story of Walnut Grove would remain complete and untouched by future reinterpretations that might dilute its meaning. By removing the physical setting of the town, he effectively closed the door on any continuation that did not preserve the spirit of the original series. In his view, the emotional legacy of Little House on the Prairie deserved a clear conclusion rather than a gradual fading away. The explosions seen on screen were not meant as an act of anger or spectacle. Instead, they represented a creator's determination to protect something he had spent years building. In the end, the decision reflected both love for the show and the belief that some stories are strongest when they are allowed to end with purpose, rather than simply continuing until their meaning is lost.